I am Kate Allred, and I'm an attorney at Quinn Emmanuel or Carton Sullivan.
Wow, what kind of attorney are you? What do you do?
So I am a part of the world's largest litigation only firm. So I'm a general litigator. I handle all types of disputes, appeals, and just everything in between. I do IP stuff, constitutional law, regulatory, breach of contract, a wide gamut of industries, and it's very fun.
When did you know you wanted to be a lawyer?
I don't know. Ever since I was a little kid, I wanted to be a lawyer. I used to get my stuffed animals and assemble a courtroom, and I would play all the different parts. But I always knew I wanted to be a lawyer.
And is it everything you hoped it would be?
Yes, I've enjoyed it. It's been a great career. I've been doing it about 4 years since law school. It is very stretching and very demanding. It's a very challenging profession. There are no easy cases that come through our door, but it's intellectually rigorous and stimulating. But I enjoy the advocacy element of it. And I also enjoy my colleagues who are terrific people and make the long hours enjoyable.
Are they long hours or do you work more than 40 hours a week?
I do. I typically work more than 40 hours a week. For those that don't know, the billable hour is the taskmaster of a big law attorney, and it just depends on the nature of my case. We're basically on call 24/7 at any point. The client might need us to do something, especially in litigation. There's often emergency motions, or I've represented several pharmaceutical companies who had some actions threatened by the FDA that were emergent, and we, had to spend 24 hours getting multiple briefs and motions prepared to just stop those actions from happening. And so that's the challenging part. I mean, the good thing about my firm is that I get to work from home whenever I want. I can go into the office in Salt Lake, but there's a lot of flexibility in my schedule. So I can have breakfast with my kids, often eat lunch with them. I step away every night for dinner and bedtime, and then I can work a bit later in the night. But it's not always as crazy it is right now. I'm in the midst of a huge discovery battle. And so lots to be done in that.
So, taking a step back to when you were at BYU Idaho, knowing that you knew that you wanted to be a lawyer. So, what did you do when you were at BYU Idaho to position yourself to get into the law school you wanted to get into?
Well, that's so one funny comment. Brother Kirkham, who used to be an adjunct professor, who was an attorney, city attorney for Idaho Falls, he told the pre-law society, if you want to be a lawyer, to be rich, make lots of money, and not work hard, that's the wrong profession. That would be dentistry. And so maybe I should have become a dentist. But anyway, so I also, in addition to knowing I wanted to be a lawyer, ever since I was young, I knew I wanted to go into political science. And so from the get go, I knew that's where I wanted to be. And I remember my first semester, I had international relations with Brother Adamson and comparative politics with Brother Carter, and it was awesome. And just all of my classes were basically geared toward knowing I wanted to go to law school. So the point was get really good grades and take interesting classes, but also it was helpful to basically do all of the classes. The academic advisors might not like this, but I essentially almost all my electives were in the political science department.
Wow.
And it's because I enjoyed the classes, I enjoyed the professors, and I knew I would do well in them because of my natural interest in the topics. And so essentially everything I did was geared toward knowing I was going to go to law school, but also taking classes that I enjoyed. Now I ventured out to take a few other classes, but I remember I had a conversation early on with an academic advisor and like, well, you should branch out because you don't necessarily know what you want to do. I'm like, well, I do. And I love these classes. I mean, all the public policy classes, executive branch, legislative branch, judicial branch, like the theory courses, they were all just so enjoyable to be a part of. And if it's worth talking about, in law school, there were actually a lot of BYU Idaho graduates in my class. and the Mighty Oaks, right, from Rexburg, Idaho. And we actually did pretty good or pretty well in law school. They tell you can go to law school with any background or any major. But I will say, having gone to BYU Idaho, I felt a bit more prepared than some of my peers for some of the tangible topics because, BYU Idaho is such a strong teaching institution and hands on learning and simulations. And because of that, there were several classes where I felt like I already had an advantage. I mean, one of my favorite classes in law school was public international law. And because I took so many international law courses, I knew theories and frameworks that translated into the legal side of things. And my professor at one point said, because I'd make comments, he'd say, now, just because Kate's talking about these theories doesn't mean you need to know these theories. But I ended up doing really well in that course, in large part because of BYU, but BYU Idaho, and it's interesting too, a lot of my friends at law school that were political science students at other universities, including BYU, they were in classes with hundreds of students, very theoretical. And again, I feel like I learned a lot of the theory at BYU Idaho, but the point I'm trying to say is I would tell them, for example, about a simulation we would do in international law or a simulation we would do in foreign policy. And they were always surprised, like, that we have that level of hands-on practical learning experience.
Yeah. You're actually, by the way, not the first attorney that told me they took every political science class they could. A lot of people do that. But it is true that, like, a lot of people will advise you if you want to go to law school, do something easy for your undergrad so you can get your easy A because GPA matters so much. So I appreciate what you shared about how much the degree helped you. But what would you say to students that want to go to law school, but maybe political science is hard for them? Would you tell them take the easy way or just stick with it?
I would I think there's an advantage to a political science degree, especially if you're going to law school, because so much of what we learn in law school is tied and tethered to what we learn in a political science major. And again, for me, because I was passionate about it, it wasn't a walk in the park always. Some of the classes I felt were challenging, but I enjoyed the subject matter so much that it allowed me to stretch myself. And one thing too, as a newer student, it's a little bit more difficult to kind of get acquainted and oriented to the lay of the land. But I felt as the years progressed at BYU Idaho, I got more comfortable in the courses and felt more confident that, you know, I would take this class and I would do well because I've done well in these similar classes in the past.
I remember about you, Cade, that because I think I only had you for maybe one, maybe two classes, but I remember about you that you were intent on getting an A. And so you would approach me and be like, look, I'm going to get an A in this class. What do I need to do to get an A? You were really, really intentional about your grades, where I find that a lot of students aren't that way. So for students who maybe aren't as familiar with academia and how it works and things like that, what would you advise students that really want to get a good GPA? Like, what did you have to do different that other students weren't doing to make sure that you got the grades you were looking for?
So, I mean, I would say, was it research methods was the class I did? That was probably the hardest political science class just because it was so different from anything that I've ever done before. But I think communicating with the professor is really important. I mean, I once had a class with Brother Smith, who I really appreciate, and I did really well on a test. But I still went in. I mean, I got an A on the test, but I still went in on some of the questions that I missed to figure out what I could have done better in that essay to have improved. And I think that's an important element of education where at the end of the day, it's your mastery of the subject and trying to understand. But I mean, some of my other classes that I had to take, I took light and sound for one of my science courses. And, that was a hit and miss in the grading, but I remember I would go up to the professor after class, and anytime I missed something, I wanted to understand why I missed it so I could avoid making the same mistake. And a lot of it is just you have to put in the work to be able to do well. And in law school too, everything's curved, and the curve is a fickle, ar- a very arbitrary. line, and sometimes you fall below that, sometimes you fall above that. And the part of that is the grit and stamina. Even if you do poorly in one class, you pick yourself up, you dust yourself off, and you keep going.
Yeah. I don't know if you know this, but BYU now has this, I don't know, exemption or something where you don't have to take the LSAT. If you have an ACT score, I think it's in the top 15% from high school people, and a GPA in like the 3.7 range, you can bypass the LSAT and still maybe get into BYU. What would you say to students that are thinking about skipping the LSAT and trying to take a path like that?
I didn't have that option at the time, and so that one's tough. I actually enjoyed the LSAT. It was intense, tons of studying, on an off semester, that's you have to really dive down, but I felt it really did a good job at acquainting yourself with the art of logic and logical thinking, and I feel like the LSAT was ultimately beneficial, all that preparation for loss.
Yeah, so just to be clear, you took a whole semester prepping for the LSAT.
Yes, yep. I was off track and, like, treat it like a job, basically. You're studying every day, all day. You're doing multiple exams. And anyway, it is a stretching and challenging thing, but I will say it's nothing like the bar. The bar is much I mean, the bar was fine. I did great on the bar, but the bar is just a crazy thing, and the LSAT is not. It was a walk in the park compared to the the time that you needed to devote to preparing for the bar.
So students who want to go to law school really should like this is what your story isn't an unusual story. This is what's expected of students that you dedicate that kind of time preparing for the LSAT. In part because once you're done with law school, you're expected to spend that kind of time prepping for the bar exam. And so students who are sort of like, well, I'll do some practice LSATs, I'll see how I do. I'll get somewhere close to a 150 or something like that. That's just not going to cut it.
Yeah. Well, and also to the LSAT, I mean, they got rid of the logic games. I know the scores have increased generally. I mean, BYU's mean or median to get into the law school is much higher than it was when I applied a handful of years ago. And so I think that it requires some dedication and consistency. But also, too, I think one way to look at it is a stewardship. I mean, the sad reality when I was a new law student, you'd ask advice from mentors and they'd say, get good grades. And so I started asking, besides getting good grades, what can I do to be successful? But then over time, you realize the problem with the world, no, it's not necessarily a problem, is how you do on the LSAT can determine what law school you get into, what law school you get into, and how well you do in law school directly correlates to what type of job you can get outside of law school. It's a very stratified industry and career field. And I remember sitting in as a 1L in law school, and they'd say, grades don't really matter unless you want a clerk, you want to go to big law, and you want to be a judge or a professor. And I would say, I kind of want all of those at some point of my career. And so again, I took it as a stewardship where I owe it to the Lord, to my family. And also, I mean, you think of the people that invest for my education at a church sponsored university. I want to give them the best return on that investment.
Yeah, that's great. So I tell students if they don't get into BYU law, that like they just shouldn't go to law school. Maybe that's bad advice, but it feels like the cost of BYU law relative to the return you can get on that investment is greater at BYU law than any other law school. But what advice would you give to students about like thinking about where to go to law school and things like that?
So that's a great question. John Ivers, I don't know if you know Brother Ivers,
Yeah,
but
he's
great
great.
mentor, one of my favorite professors at BYU Idaho. He went across the campus with him. And anytime he got to talk to him, I just would hang out with him. And we're walking and we were talking about law school applications. Again, that was a stressful period of time because you just don't know a lot of variables you can't control. And I remember talking to him, he said, let me give you some advice. never tell yourself no. It's always better to try and let someone else tell you no. And so he said, apply to some schools that you might not think you will get into just to see, right? And so I applied to a handful of schools. I applied to Michigan, Georgetown, George Washington, BYU was my top choice. I always joke Utah was my safety school, but my super safety school was the University of Nebraska because they offered me full ride and I did get accepted there. But I really wanted to go to BYU. That was where I wanted to be. And one thing too, I could have gotten into George at Washington waitlisted and then it was given an offer. And at the time they were ranked higher than BYU. Now they're not. They're ranked below BYU and they're $70,000 a year. And so, I mean, it's just crazy. I had a friend that went to Columbia. He was a BYU undergrad. He went to Columbia, thousands of dollars in debt following his degree. Now, he's very wise with money, making lots of money as a lawyer now and is almost debt free. But I had a big advantage of going to BYU Idaho than BYU because it makes it to where if I wanted a career that wasn't as lucrative, because there are a lot of careers in law that aren't as lucrative as the type of career I'm in right now. If I wanted to go work for the government or a special interest or public law type situations, going to BYU, that's no problem if that makes sense. Because, but sorry, back to your question of what to do. I mean, I talked to one of my friends from my ward growing up, my one of my neighbors, and I gave him some advice. I said, you know, the things they tell you is if you want to practice in a certain geographic area, try to go to that state's law school, the best law school in that state. And there's some regional schools and there's some national schools. The fun thing about BYU, because of the connections of the church, it is an international, there's BYU people everywhere. But if I wanted to be a prosecutor, say in Spokane, Washington, Gonzaga would be a great law school to go to because that's where the alumni connections will be.
Yeah, that's great. Kate, anything else you want to share with students at BYU Idaho?
Well, my wife and I, we took my niece to BYU Idaho in December and actually waved to you through your little window. You were busy, so I didn't open the door, but it was so fun to be back. And we love BYU Idaho. The depth of the education we received, the quality of the education, and also the spiritual element of BYU Idaho was such a rewarding place. And I really do feel like going to BYU Idaho was such a springboard to my career and also just the quality of life in so many different facets that my wife and I enjoy. We can trace back to our time in Rexburg.
That's awesome. Thanks, Kate. Okay, I'm going to stop recording.
Okay.